Welcome to Kevin Makes Cool Things. I'm Kevin, and this is my Demon King's dagger from the solo leveling manhwa. These are the daggers that the main character gets after defeating, you guessed it, the Demon King. The Demon King's daggers are actually a set of two identical daggers. I only made one, but if you want a second one for a costume or something, you're welcome to print and finish another one. This is the fourth installment in this series. It's part of a challenge I set for myself to make every dagger from the solo leveling manhwa. For some reason, this dagger came out feeling really small. In the promotional picture and the introductory video, I'm having my significant other hold it so it doesn't look nearly as tiny. It's basically the same size as the other daggers, it's just that the handle is smaller in comparison. If you're going to print this, I'd recommend checking the size and scaling it up by 20 to 30%. The design for this dagger in the manhwa was all over the place. Details like the guard that covers your fingers weren't always present. We also see this shadowy smoke coming off the dagger, which is awesome, but not something I can replicate with my 3D printer. I decided to use this image as a reference. It's not the flashiest, but it's easy to work off of, and I like the design. I especially liked how the handle was wrapped in this one. It's different from some of the other daggers, and I think it looks cool. I'll talk a little more about that later in the video. I moved into GIMP and started to make a clean outline I could follow. I filled in some parts that were missing, and I was ready to move into Blender. I invested a fair amount of time in this before going back to GIMP and making some changes to the reference image. In Blender, I couldn't keep the layers straight and figure out what I was working on. I fixed the reference image by adding some simple colors and labeling the different parts. This meant that I could name the pieces in Blender accordingly and always knew what I was working on. It helped a lot, especially when there weren't obvious names for some of these different overlapping scales. I took another stab at this and it went way better, both because I had more experience with it and I had a better reference to work off of. I had what I thought was a brilliant plan for this. I was going to 3D print each of these scales separately, finish and paint them, and then fit them back together. This would have made the sanding and painting way easier, and there wouldn't have been any crevices which I couldn't access. Long story short, it didn't work. I had some errors in Blender, and my laptop wasn't powerful enough to handle some of this. A bit of a spoiler for next month's video, but I got a new PC which is a lot more powerful, and tried the same approach on the Kamish daggers, which should be out next month. I ended up deciding it was a bad idea, regardless of my computer's processing power, but that's a story for another time. After I made one half of these pieces, I used a mirror modifier to double it. Then I tweaked a lot of the little details and angles to get this to feel organic. I experimented with some alternative designs for the handle. These were based on these images, which look cool but are hard to implement. I decided to stick with the wrapped handle for two reasons. The first reason is it looks cool. I especially like how the wrapping runs around this spike on the pommel, which is something I've never seen before. For the second reason, I'll talk about that when I'm showing you how I primed this. I made the spike on the pommel and handled a few other little details before finishing the full version. Along the way, I realized some of these pieces had the inside and the outside reversed, so I had to go back and fix that. I'm not used to thinking about this, especially not coming from OpenSCAD, so I often forget to check until the end of a project. All of my models are non-manifold and need to be repaired. I could probably fix this if I really wanted to, but it's easier to just let Repetier Host repair them at the end. Like my other daggers, I divided this up by overlapping it with cubes and doing an intersection. This created chunks of the dagger which were perfect for printing. Then I used a difference modifier to cut out small cylinders between the pieces, so I could put bits of nail between these to align the pieces during gluing. I printed the eyes separately so I could do a better job sanding and painting them. I attached everything together with 2-part epoxy. I used clamps on the blade because it was a flat surface, but I couldn't really get them on the handle with the irregular shapes. I ended up using rubber bands to hold everything in position, and it worked great. I sanded this with my Dremel tool and then applied wood filler. As you can see, I'm working on this in parallel with my Baruka's dagger build from last month. I often work on multiple projects at the same time, and applying wood filler to both in a single sitting allows me to get more done with less cleanup in between. After the wood filler dried, I went back and sanded this. I relied heavily on small files to define some of these details and get into the small cracks between the pieces. There were some areas, like the crevices between some of the scales, which I couldn't do much about, so I'm looking into buying some additional sanding bits for future projects. At this point, I realized I forgot to put wood filler on the eyes, so I went back and did that. I primed this with some spray-on sandable primer. This is a different type than I've used in my last few videos, and I like it a lot more. I alluded to this earlier, but one of the reasons I chose to wrap the handle was to speed up priming. I like to prime my pieces in a single go, but that creates a problem, because you can't put something that's completely covered in paint down and let it dry. When a piece of the print is going to be covered in a different material, like the handle, you can wrap it in tape and hang this piece up. That makes the priming process go way faster. After priming this, I lightly sanded everything and cleaned up a few little details before moving on to the final colors. I mixed some colors and started painting this. I made some sloppy mistakes early on, so it did take me a couple of days to get the golden red finished. Then I painted the blade black. I also painted the handle black, just so any mistakes I made while wrapping this wouldn't be too obvious. I sprayed this with a matte clear coat. Once again, I wrapped the handle in tape and hung this to dry, which made the process way easier. I'm proud to report that for the first time in a long time, I didn't drop and break a project. I really shouldn't have to brag about that, but it's been a long few months. I bought some fake leather lace to wrap the handle with. It was around $10 on Amazon and had mediocre reviews, but I figured it would be fine. This stuff doesn't really bend, so looping it through the spike on the pommel didn't go great. I ended up having to clip it to get it to turn sharply. I wrapped the lace around the handle and superglued it in place. I didn't bother wearing gloves for this because it was such easy work. I only superglued my fingers together a couple of times. The hardest part of this was getting the lacing to line up with these details. I actually messed this up in one place and decided to peel back the lacing and cut it off. Then I spliced in a new piece that lined up with the detail perfectly. It was a risk, but I think it was the right choice. I glued small sections of lacing in between the details to make it look like this is wrapped all around. It's not perfect, but I think it's pretty good. And with that, it was done. It's not my favorite solo leveling dagger, but I think it came out pretty nicely and I learned a lot. Although it's a relatively minor detail, I found the different approaches to wrapping the handle to be weirdly fascinating. Next month should be the Kamish daggers. I've got the models made, but I'm having some minor issues with my printer. I'm not sure if I'll cover both daggers in a single video or split it up between two different videos. Either way, if you're interested, you should stay tuned. The files for this are posted on Thingiverse. I'll put a link in the description if you want to make your own. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like so YouTube will recommend this to more people. If you want to support the channel and see my other projects, then please subscribe.